Hi, this is Dr. Gregory Sadler. I'm a professor of philosophy and the president and founder of an educational consulting company called Reason.io, where we put philosophy into practice. I've studied and taught philosophy for over 20 years, and I find that many people run into difficulties reading classic philosophical texts. Sometimes it's the way things are said or how the text is structured. But the concepts themselves are not always that complicated, and that's where I come in. To help students and lifelong learners, I've been producing longer lecture videos and posting them to YouTube. Many viewers say they find them useful. What you're currently watching is part of a new series of shorter videos, each of them focused on one core concept from an important philosophical text. I hope you find it useful as well. In part one of his work Ressentiment, Max Scheler is going to discuss what he calls specifically spiritual varieties of ressentiment. And what he means by spiritual, it's the translation of the word geistige, which can mean also mental. So think higher values. Could be philosophical, could be scientific, could be artistic. It engages the higher parts of the human being. And he's going to start out by mentioning there's two that I want to talk about, but he'll actually talk about three main sorts. So he says two specifically spiritual varieties of ressentiment. Humanity are the apostate type, so a type, right? And to a lesser degree, the romantic state of mind, or at least one of its essential traits. But he's also going to discuss a sort of critical, more or less philosophical, although this could play out in music and literature and other places as well, sort of attitude as well. So let's start by talking about the apostate. And so this is a specifically religious term, but it doesn't just pertain to religion. Apostasy is a, standing away from where you began. And so, if you leave a particular religion and its community and you convert to another one, you can be viewed by that religious community as an apostate. But it could also be, you're committed to utilitarianism and the effective altruist movement, and then you have a change of heart and you're like, I'm going to be a selfish bastard and just do everything to benefit myself and screw the rest of humanity, because that would be a kind of apostasy as well. And this can happen in different ways, meaning that it can have different characteristics to it. So he's going to say, first, what is an apostate not? Not a person who once in their life radically changes their deepest religious, political, legal, or philosophical convictions. And it doesn't really matter whether the change is a sudden rupture or whether it's continuous. It's the way in which they have changed. So he's going to say, even after his conversion is moving from one thing to another, the true apostate is not primarily committed to the positive contents of his new belief and to the realization of its aims. He might appear to be so, and he might talk that way to other people, but that's not really what is motivating the apostate in this sense. They haven't had a genuine conversion, as we could say, or another way of saying it, as a religious type, the apostate is at the opposite pole from the resurrected, whose life is transformed by a new faith, which is full of intrinsic meaning and value. If you really have changed from A to B, you don't need to constantly talk about A. You can just talk about B and how great it is and why you're attracted to it and how wonderful it is to be in touch with genuine values at this point. The apostate isn't like that. What is the apostate doing? So Scheler says that he's motivated by the struggle against the old belief and lives only for its negation. So you could think, for example, in our own time about atheist Christian polemics, right? And we'll take sort of evangelical Christians, although certain conservative Catholics would also fit neatly into this as well. So you can start out as being a very secular sort of person growing up in a mindset where religion is really for stupid people, and then you shift your way of looking at things. You convert, you become committed to Jesus, you meet Jesus, however you conceive of that, and now all you talk about is not how great religion is, not how wonderful it is to be a Christian. I mean, you might touch on that, but how awful it is to be an atheist. And we see atheists do this too, don't they? They come from a religious background and, they become an atheist, and now they're congratulating themselves constantly about how wonderful it is not to be like those stupid, superstitious Christians who believe all sorts of nonsense. And, Scheler's actually going to bring up a very interesting Christian example, Tertullian, who Nietzsche also brought up in his work, that this work is a commentary on it in a way. Tertullian asserts the sight of Roman governors burning in hell is one of the chief sources of heavenly beatitude. I mean, if that is how you think of heaven, what beatitude would actually be like. It's not so much being with God. It's looking at those bastards down below and their rightful suffering, and we're righteous, we won't suffer like. Well, you're not really a Christian then, right? You're not really about relationship with God. You're really about making somebody else worse off than you. And so he goes on and he says that the apostate doesn't affirm his new convictions for their own sake. He's engaged in a continuous chain of acts of revenge against his own spiritual past. So this is why ressentiment figures in there. It is a kind of aiming at revenge, right? And note what Scheler says. In reality, he remains a captive of this past, and the new faith is just a handy frame of reference for negating and rejecting the old. So this is not an engagement with genuine values for their own sake. I mean, it could be engaging with genuine values, but not for the sake of those values, but rather because they negate something else, what it is that you're supposed to have left behind. So that's a spiritual type of ressentiment. Then he should be talking about romanticism, but he's going to put that off a little bit. And he says, to a lesser degree, a secret ressentiment underlies every way of thinking which attributes creative power to mere negation and criticism. And he says this is where a lot of modern philosophy is. But we could also think of a lot of modern literary criticism, a lot of art, a lot of, all sorts of other things as well. So he goes on and he says modern philosophy is deeply penetrated by a whole type of thinking which is nourished by ressentiment. And what is he talking about? Points of view that say that the true and the given is not what is self-evident, but rather what is indubitable or incontestable, which can be maintained against doubt and criticism. So you don't have again, genuine encounter with values. Instead, it's sort of the negation of something shows you that you've got something good or true or right there. And he says, an example of this is the dialectical method. And he puts that in quotes, which wants to produce not only not A, but even B through the negation of A. And he brings up Spinoza at this point, his omnis determinatio est negatio, every determination is a negation. He brings up Hegel, and there's actually a note here, a footnote, which says that Darwin, by the way, I think is doing this as well. So you can look that up if you want to. But this dialectical method, it's not something that actually goes out to encounter genuine valuations. It's something that says, we're moving along and finding things out through critical approaches to things. He says, all the seemingly positive valuations and judgments of ressentiment are actually hidden devaluations and negations. Whenever convictions are not arrived at by direct contact with the world and the objects themselves, but indirectly through a critique of the positions of others, then the processes of thinking are impregnated with ressentiment. So, he says, genuine and fruitful criticism judges all opinions with reference to the object itself. You have to actually look at things. Ressentiment criticism, on the contrary, accepts no object that has not stood the test of criticism. And I'd like to pause here for a moment. Scheler is a very important person in what we call the phenomenological movement. And if you have heard of this, you may have heard of Edmund Husserl and Martin Heidegger. Scheler was as important as them to early phenomenology. And Husserl had this wonderful slogan, back to the things themselves. Scheler wasn't just saying back to the things, also back to the values, back to the experiences themselves. And he's saying that, good philosophy that is not, motivated by ressentiment is going to have to take some things as self-evident through experience, through encountering them. So that's another one that we can talk about. Now we've got two different modes or types of spiritual ressentiment. What about the third, romanticism, or the romantic frame of mind or type of mind? It says in a different sense, ressentiment is always to some degree a determinant of this romantic type of mind when the romantic nostalgia for some past era, which could be ancient Greeks, it could be the Middle Ages. We could think about people in the present who are in love with Sparta or Rome, or pick whatever else it is that you like. Those sorts of imagined, it could be the Vikings, people like to do that. He says it's not primarily based on the values of that period, but on the wish to escape from the present. So if you're all about Rome, because we live in a degenerate time, and it was so much better when we lived like Romans, well, you're probably falling into the kind of romanticism that Scheler is talking about here. And he's got a contrast, right? He talks about Hölderlin and his love for ancient Greece. He says it's primary and entirely positive. It springs from deep congeniality with the Greek mind and character. Right? Hölderlin was a very important German poet. On the other hand, Friedrich Schlegel's nostalgia for the Middle Ages is strongly tinged with ressentiment. So, there's a lot of ways in which the praise of the past, like he says, has the purpose of downgrading the present day reality, of, pushing it away, denigrating it. And he's going to say the formal structure of ressentiment expression, again, tied in with these spiritual expressions, is always the same. A is affirmed, valued, praised, but why? Not for its intrinsic quality, but for a different reason. For the unverbalized intention of denying, devaluating, and denigrating B. A, he says, is played off against B. That's the secret desire that is motivating it. That's why these are forms of ressentiment. And so he wants to put us on guard against these because, we don't want to fall into them. But we also don't want to be too hasty to condemn anybody who has had a, change of religion, of philosophy, of, politics as being an apostate. We don't want to automatically condemn all modern philosophy. We don't want to condemn all romantic frames of mind. It has to do with how they actually play out. And this, he's giving us here a sort of general structure that we can use to identify it in others, perhaps also within ourselves.